We're going to wind up Chapter 7 by talking about the preparation of the financial budget and then looking at flexible budgeting. So as I talked about in our last couple videos, the master budget has two sides to it. We've got the operating budget and the financial budget. It is not as though these two budgets live in complete isolation from one another. There is certainly interplay when we talk about sales versus what we expect we're going to collect, and our cash budget versus what we can afford to spend. And so these items at very critical junctures will feed into one another. When beginning our financial budget, we've got to first figure out what we're going to have to work with in terms of dollars. We refer back to the sales budget as a guidepost for this. In the beginning, we're not going to have a track record, so we're going to have to use our business judgment to determine what we think is going to be collectible in each individual quarter. Now, obviously, as we're in business longer and we can look back at prior quarters and see what the actual numbers were, we'll be able to hone these projections a little bit more precisely. In the beginning, we just kind of have to use our best judgment. But in this case, we anticipate that in quarter one, we're going to collect 30% of the prior fourth quarter sales and then 65% of the first quarter sales. And we're going to anticipate that those are going to be good numbers all the way down. So in theory, after 2 quarters, we will have collected 95% of what we were owed for particular sales. Kind of makes you wonder about that other 5%, but that'll another issue for another day. Based on what we think we're going to collect, we can then start to prepare our cash collection schedule in terms of actual dollars. Again, remembering that this was all premised based on our sales projections. So we can now convert that into dollars in each quarter, and we know what we think we're going to have coming in. From there, we can essentially decide, okay, we are only going to spend a percentage of what we have collected in this at any particular point in time. So by basing our purchases on what we've collected, that keeps those two items really closely linked together so that we're not just deciding what we're going to buy in isolation from what we actually collected and have to spend. So we're going to spend 50% of what we collected for the prior quarter's purchases and 50% of current quarter purchases, and on down the line. And from that, we can then make our cash payment schedule. So now we've gotten to the cash budget, and this is really where a lot of these pieces come home to roost, especially from the operating budget side of things. So Big Bad Bikes has a minimum cash balance requirement of $10,000. They, based on their quarter one, are going to start with more than that, so that's all great. They've got the budgeted amount that they think that they will collect, and they've decided to sell a little bit of stock. So they're going to collect $50,500 during the period. If we add that to what they started with, that starts them off with $63,500. But is it enough? Well, they've got the budgeted payments that they're going to be making. They've got then their direct labor budget. They've got the manufacturing overhead budget, their selling and administrative budget. All of these things plus taxes tells them what they're going to need to spend. Well, lo and behold, what it's going to cost them to be in business is more than the cash that they will have on hand. So they're going to end up with a cash deficit of $7,485. Because they don't want to just have enough cash available to just zero that out, they're going to need to borrow their deficit plus an extra 10,000 to maintain that little kind of comfort zone to make sure that they aren't running completely out of cash. Now, the second quarter, things are a little better. They at least don't have a deficit, but it's certainly not enough to get them to their minimum cash balance, so they're going to have to borrow a little more. Now, note that despite the fact that they've got a surplus of cash, and because it's not enough to meet the 10,000, and they will have to borrow more, there's really nothing to pay down the 17,000 that they had to borrow the next quarter or the prior quarter. So they're 2 quarters in and they have drawn down heavily on this line of credit. But things start to turn around. As you remember, they thought that their sales would ramp up and they were going to raise their prices a little bit going into quarter 3. So things start to, at least from a budgeted standpoint, look a little bit better. And they get to the end of quarter 3 and they've got 11,000 and change left. So not only do they have enough left over so that they can cover the initial 10,000, but they can spend 11,265 paying off some of what they had borrowed during the previous quarters and still have that $10,000 cash reserve. We follow them through the fourth quarter and we see that they are able to have enough cash left over that they are able to entirely pay off the line, what they had drawn off the line of credit during the first 2 quarters, and then have well more than the 10,000 that that is their minimum cash on hand balance. So as I've probably said more times than or maybe just in my head, where a lot of companies get into trouble is when they get into this surplus range where they have that money left over and they think, oh man, some breathing room. Wouldn't it be nice to have more than just our minimum cash on hand? So rather than taking this little bit extra and paying it, paying down what they had drawn, they just continue to fold the extra into their operating. And inevitably, if this company had done that over 2 quarters, they would theoretically have plenty more cash on hand, but then they'd have this debt that they hadn't paid off. And if they aren't really looking at that holistically, and somebody just looks at the bank balance and says, woohoo, we have so much more than we are required to have for our minimum balance. Why don't we go buy something with it? And, we can make payments on that line of credit at 19% interest. And so, I mean, it is unlikely that they are going to be able to spend or invest this money in a way that the recovery will exceed the 19% interest that they're going to pay by not paying off this line of credit. So as tempting as it might be to hang on to the cash and make the minimum monthly payments on the line of credit, paying off the line of credit is the far more fiscally prudent way to go. Now you may remember, and I can sort of roll back to the last slides. In our last lecture where we talked about being able to calculate based on the costs for inventory and then what we think we're going to sell, what our cost of goods sold would be and our budgeted ending inventory would be. And of these two figures, all we used on the operating budget side of this was the cost of goods sold figure because that contributed to the budgeted income statement. Now, here we are over on the financial side of things, and we're going to need that ending inventory figure because on the financial budgeting side of things is where we're going to be preparing our budgeted balance sheet. And that budgeted balance sheet is going to need to have an ending inventory figure in it. So all of those costs that we had calculated out on the operational side of it are really necessary when it comes to preparing the budgeted balance sheet on the financial side of the master budget. We're going to wind up this chapter with a little discussion about preparation of the flexible budgets. Um, so one of the benefits of budgeting is we can then look at what we actually did in terms of performance and spending and compare it to our budget and determine how well we did. How successful were we? How good were our projections? Did we meet our targets? And to the extent that our actual numbers differ from our budgeted numbers, we call those a variance. We're going to look at that variance, and if we have a favorable variance, this is when our actual performance exceeds our projections. An unfavorable variance is when our performance doesn't meet our projections. And you can go either way, even within the same budget on those. So we begin with our static budget, which is what we had projected, and we will use that static budget in the flexible budget because that will serve as our point of comparison. So here you'll see the static budget, and then we've got a column in the flexible budget that includes all the budgeted items from the static budget. We then, on the flexible budget, we include our actuals and have a variance column. And that column will compare the two, and if it is in brackets, that means it's unfavorable. In other words, we failed to meet our budgeted figure. So this is units sold. This isn't in dollars. This is in units. You know, our sales price didn't change from what we had budgeted. And then we start looking at materials, and we did pretty well, except things were not great when we got to gross profit. And why is that? Well, we sold a bunch less than we anticipated we would sell. So while we kept our costs in line because our sales figures didn't match what we had budgeted, we didn't gross nearly what we had hoped to. And despite the fact that we had done better on our fixed costs than we had anticipated, it still wasn't enough to compensate overall for our shortfall in terms of sales. So, I mean, this is a great example where you can hold the line real tightly on your costs and be very lean, but if your sales targets don't come to bear, you are going to be worse off than, all of the good spending often can't compensate for a lack of sales. And that's pretty much it. In an online class, I can't really have a class discussion with you about these items or go through sample problems with you, so I'm going to call it quits here.